Paul is saying that there is this line of life that comes out from the gospel. And to believe in Jesus means to continually walk that line. This is the old Johnny Cash song. There's this line that comes out from the gospel, and now we walk the line. That's exactly what Paul is saying, and that's what this word means. And to watch this, to not rightly walk the line is hypocrisy. Walk the line. If you don't, hypocrisy. That is what is behind this text. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do a YouTube blast this afternoon and get like in a hole on YouTube and watch too many of these videos. But whenever an officer does a field sobriety test and they take the likely intoxicated person and they ask them to walk 1 foot immediately in front of the other on that line that's on the side of the road, that picture right there, that is this Greek word orthopodeo. But you know what happens in these videos? These people stumble and trip and dance and they lose balance and they do all sorts of things. But the whole point is them walking that line correctly 1 foot in front of the other is what Paul is saying should be done if you're following Jesus. And that's the kind of thing that's behind Paul's frustration here is people are off dancing on the side of the road or something. That people aren't walking the line. That is the gospel orthopodeo that we are called to, and people are missing it. But let's do this. Let's do this for a second. Let's push these metaphors together. And if you do, guess what that actually gets to? It actually means that legalism is actually what makes you drunk and not able to walk the line. You got it? Hypocrisy is inebriation, and you can't walk straight. Like keeping score, keeping a record of wrongs, like Paul says love doesn't do in 1 Corinthians. Keeping score, keeping a record of wrongs, those kinds of things. That kind of stuff intoxicates you and doesn't let you walk the line correctly. You feel that? Those are the mixed metaphors and word pictures behind this text. But don't forget what I said. There's actually a story behind this text, and we need to know this story. What is that story? Because once we figure out that story, we'll actually get an answer to our question about how to respond to hypocrisy in the church. So let's look back at verse 11. Verse 11, it starts with when Cephas came to Antioch. Now this is talking about the Apostle Peter. He also went by the name Cephas. If you remember from Jason's message last week, Peter had a unique mission. He was supposed to take the gospel of Jesus to the Jewish people so that they could understand and know and see and believe their Messiah. Paul had a different and a distinct mission to take the gospel of Jesus to the Gentiles, which was non-Jewish nations. So they each had a unique assignment and mission from God. Well, they're in Antioch, and when Peter comes to Antioch, and for you Bible nerds, this happens sometimes like in Acts 12 through 14, if you want to go look, we're not totally sure. But when Peter comes to Antioch, watch this, look, Peter was hanging out with Jewish Christians going, hey guys, tell me about the gods that you used to worship and how God set you free from that stuff in Jesus, and they were eating together, and he was not eating kosher. Peter was like throwing extra bacon on his cheeseburger, having a blast. He was sharing a glass of wine, even if it had been previously offered up at a pagan temple. It was fine. It was beyond fine. It was great because it was a way to say, yes, you're welcome into God's family through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. Now watch this. For all of Israel's history, they were supposed to be a light to the nations, to the Gentiles, to show the Gentiles that their God was the true creator and redeemer God. And in the Old Testament, part of the way that they were supposed to do that was by being separate and distinct when it came to social ethics, including things like dietary regulations. But now, Jesus the Messiah had come and he had fulfilled the law, and now those old specifications were no longer the way to show the nations that Israel's God was the true God. And you probably know this, you might even feel this in your own life, but sharing a meal with somebody is deeply intimate. And in the first century, 1,000 times more so. You know what? No fast food, no microwaves, no ovens like we have today. To share a meal with somebody was a calculated and deliberate act of intimacy, to be at table together. And you know what? Here it is. We got to get this, because if we don't get this first part, we'll miss the second part. Peter was doing that, and he was doing a great job. He was killing it. Way to go, Peter. Good job. He wasn't wearing a mask, and he was walking the line. Food laws and dietary regulations and other lists of laws and instructions are not the way to get in right relationship with God. Jesus is the way and the truth and the life for that. So Peter was doing it right. But here it is. Here's where it turns. But here's what you need to know. Jesus' brother James was pastoring in Jerusalem, and James sent some Jewish Christians from Jerusalem to Antioch to take up a collection for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. He says that in verse 10, remember the poor, remember these poor people and these poor Christians in Jerusalem. So James sends this squad from Jerusalem to Antioch to see Peter. And some of these Jewish Christians, you got to get this for Jewish believers, some of these Jewish Christians from Jerusalem were really, really struggling with Gentiles becoming followers of Jesus without having to do all the food laws and all the circumcision and all the stuff. And the false teachers around Galatia were leveraging that struggle and toying with the consciences of these Jewish Christians. Now, if you missed some of that, here's what we're doing. When this group from James in Jerusalem shows up into town and Peter's eating with Gentiles, what does Peter do? He actually, and proverbially, pushes back from the table where he was eating with the Gentiles. And I don't know if he actually said it, it's Peter. We can assume he said almost anything, right? But he basically goes, what are you guys doing? You guys are so bacon? Ew, gross. Like, that's what he's doing. Peter's like, how dare you? You want to be holy? Have you ever actually read the Bible, guys? Come on. And he pushes back from the table and goes, how dare you? And because it's Peter, maybe you hear echoes from a few years before when Jesus was arrested and he's like following in the shadows. And three different people, 3 different times go up to Peter and go, hey, you're one of the guys. You follow him. You're one of his disciples. 3 times. He goes, I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about? I'm here for the fire. I have no idea what you're saying. 3 times in a row. Ashamed. Hypocrisy. And man, I really pray that that's not us, right? That we wouldn't be ashamed of the gospel or ashamed of Jesus who loves us. God, would you protect us from hypocrisy like this? Now it's subtle, but Paul actually tells us the mechanism, the reason behind Peter's lack of gospel orthopedics in Antioch. He didn't just wake up one day, I know it is Peter and we can use our imaginations, but he didn't just wake up one day and be like, you know what today is? Hypocrisy day. Let's do this. That's not the case. That's not how it went. Look at verse 12. We actually have the reason. Verse 12 says, Peter separated himself because, it might say in a different translation, just the verb, but it's a causal reality. Peter separated himself because he feared the circumcision party. And on one level, anything called the circumcision party, we should be afraid of, all right? Let's just take that to the bank, boys and girls. And you are so lucky because I have tons of good material, awkward Bible jokes that I'm not gonna give you, so you're welcome. You're welcome for that. It's there, guys. You have to make the joke, the circumcision party. We should all be afraid. But what this phrase actually represents is this group of Jewish Christians who were mandating that Gentiles become like Jews before or as the way to become Christians. That's what the circumcision party is referring to. But look at the verb, I would underline it. Peter feared them. He feared them. Now we don't have enough time to talk about how interpersonal relational fear between you and other people changes the way that you act. Look out, come on. But this, I don't know about you, this happened to Peter. So Peter, he thought too much, too highly about their opinion. He lived for their approval, for their praise, for their recognition. He was so anxious and scared and worried about how they would think about him, so he pushes away from the table and goes, what are you guys doing, right? Complete two-face, 2 masks, completely. And please notice, it was the fear that triggered the hypocrisy. Fear was the mechanism of the hypocrisy. And I'm not saying this is how hypocrisy works every single time, that every act of hypocrisy is birthed by or rooted in fear, but I am saying that's what this text says. And I am saying that if I look at my life enough, I might be able to see the same. It also does make perfect sense to me, especially in our day, in our achievement-driven culture where we feel like we always have to put up a facade or some digital mask even to make people think a certain way about us, I can totally see how people-pleasing, achievement-driven fear would shock any of us into hypocrisy at any second. And maybe you can do that. You can think of a moment in your life where you acted out hypocritically, and then you can trace the root of that thing back to fearing other people. And in that moment, you wanted to please people because you feared them more than you wanted to trust Jesus. And that's tough. That's a tough place to be. And so similar to being ashamed of Jesus, God, please protect us from fearing people instead of trusting you, please, Lord. Now, when the squad from James comes, and then Peter goes, whoa, what? No, guys, and he pushes away from the table with these Gentiles, what does Paul do? That's verse 11. Look at what it says. I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Let's review. Paul used to be a terrorist. I don't know how this sounded, but I guarantee it wasn't like, Peter, buddy, if you have time, ellipsis. No, no. He's coming in hot, right? I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. The word condemned actually means you got caught in the act. You got caught in the act of acting. You got caught, Peter. And Paul lets Peter have it for his hypocrisy. And here's why Paul is frustrated. You gotta get this. Along with Peter and some of the Gentile Christians in Antioch, at the table were also, watch this, some Jewish Christians who were not from Jerusalem, and they lived in Antioch. And they were slowly starting to grow in the rich beauty and the depth of the gospel of grace. And when Peter downshifted into his hypocrisy gear, he led these Jewish Christians in Antioch astray. Dude, you know how intense that is? That your hypocrisy can distract people from the gospel of grace? That's huge. Look at what it says. Look at verse 13, look. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him. And the last line of the verse is so sad, verse 13. Even Barnabas was led astray. And Barnabas, if you don't know him, he's this pure, kind, encouraging, hardworking, uplifting soul that had been in ministry for a while. And I think that's the point at which Paul's heart truly breaks and his frustration triples exponentially, just goes crazy. Now, so we don't miss this story teaches us a few things about the nature of hypocrisy and how harmful it is. So just briefly, really briefly, 3 ideas here about hypocrisy, the essence of hypocrisy, how harmful it is. First, hypocrisy infects the individual. Hypocrisy infects the individual. In our text, fear was the seed and hypocrisy was the tree, and Peter is the offending party here. But we all know that we too have participated in this in some way. We've spoken out of both sides of our mouths. Each one of us at some point has worn a mask, played another part, walked off the line. And actually, you ready? Denial that you have done so, I've never done that. Denial that you have done so is proof that you are doing so. And this thing crawls up in your soul, this hypocrisis. But here's where it gets worse. Hypocrisy doesn't just infect the individual. It can't sit still in your own heart. And that's number 2, hypocrisy confuses the community. Hypocrisy confuses the community. These Jewish Christians in Antioch, and even our guy Barnabas, they were all led astray. Meaning, you're never gonna do life in a vacuum, and your hypocrisy will always affect other people, and not for the better. Husbands, let's just pick on us for a second. If you regularly ask your wife, even nicely, to do something that you don't do or that you're not willing to do, that tells me so much about your marriage. What is the state of it now and what's the state of it gonna be? If you keep working at a job because you're like, dude, I know it's good money, but you also know how brazenly unethical it is, what is that gonna be doing to the souls of everybody attached to that business? And I think we have to laugh at it because if it's a reality, it's scary. But if there's a pattern in your life of yelling at your kids to calm down, what kind of people and what kind of parents do you think they're gonna become because of that? How scary is the line, do as I say, not as I do. What makes hypocrisy hurtful? 1, it infects the individual. 2, it confuses the community. And lastly, it maligns ministry. No apologies for alliteration here, sorry about that. And this final one is actually what pushes Paul over the edge. This is what actually gets him the most, frustrates him the most. He knows that what's ultimately on the line is not Peter's reputation, right? He knows that that's not the end all be all. Yes, it matters, but hey, it matters because it's attached to the gospel. And the freedom offered in the gospel of grace is the thing that's being maligned and eclipsed by Peter's inconsistency. And man, as a pastor, when someone refuses to do church or leaves the church because of hypocrisy, that hurts so much. Brothers and sisters, that breaks my heart. I know people who leave this church because they moved. They leave this church because they're going to another congregation to help there, to serve there, to be present there, to be Christ there. And that to me, actually, it breaks my heart a little bit. It's sad, but it's actually really beautiful to me. But if somebody leaves this church or they leave behind their faith or they refuse to do that stuff because of hypocrisy, that is the most terrifying, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking thing. Hypocrisy does so much harm to the ministry of a local church, especially among its leaders. And Paul knows all that. So God, I also pray that you would protect us from those kinds of things. Now, we've done orthopodeo. We've walked the line, Johnny Cash. We've tried to get inside the story behind this text, and we've also looked at some of the fabric and essence of hypocrisy. So, what do we do with this? Like, how does that help us answer the bigger question? What's an appropriate response to hypocrisy in the church? Well, for this, we have to remember this is not a one-off topical sermon on hypocrisy. These few verses in Galatians are not a random aside, disconnected from everything else. Surprisingly, here's the thing that we have to deal with. Paul writes these hypocrisy things in a letter about grace, right? And so we have to think about hypocrisy and grace. We have to think about their relationship just for a second. And so follow my logic for just a minute here. Follow this. If salvation, if being right with God happens because of our good works, because we earn it, if we earned or lost eternal life with God based on our performance, then there would be no need to call other people out when they were being hypocritical. There would be zero need for that. In fact, you should run the other direction from them in case their infection gets on you and confuses you. Instead, we should just run away from them, yell at them, have nothing to do with them, because their gross hypocrisy might get on us. We could even tell them, yo, get out of my way, do better, try harder, step up your game, and if you don't, I'll push you out of the way as I walk the line. If it was about works, if salvation was. Some logic like this would have to apply if we are made right with God and kept right with God because of what we do. But because we are made right with God and kept right with God, because of Jesus' work on the cross, because of what he did for us there in our place, we are actually now liberated to call people to account, to hold people to a standard. Paul is not saying, yo, Peter, check it out. I'm the standard. That's self-righteousness. Paul is saying, Peter, brother, Jesus is the standard. He's God's righteousness in a person. And that's why in verse 14, he wants people to make sure that their conduct is in step with the gospel of truth. Why? Because grace, get this, grace is both the standard and the thing that forgives us and brings us back when we stray from the standard. You got that? We got to get both of these. Grace is both the standard and the thing that brings us back when we stray from the standard. And so when Paul calls Peter out, it is not opposed to grace, it's actually an extension of it. Paul calls Peter out because he loves him, not because Paul's trying to feel better about himself. Think about it. Because Jesus never wore the mask of hypocrisy, because there was never any inconsistency in him, because he walked the line of faithfulness before the Father all the way to the cross. Because he did that, his death was sufficient enough to pay the price for all of our sin and rebellion. Because of the cross, he offers eternal life and forgiveness to all who would trust him. It is not a decent personal record book that we present before God, crossing our fingers that he would maybe have us. Instead, it is the perfect and unwavering faithfulness of Jesus that welcomes us into God's family and gives us a seat at the table. And because this passage is caught up in this bigger story of grace, that's what this means. This means we can actually, you ready? Admit our own hypocrisy, going, yeah, I'm missing it. And that means we can also approach others about it, because the gospel means we're all called to constantly depend on Jesus as the standard and not ourselves. Hypocrisy and grace, how do they go together? Let's simplify it. Walking in step with the gospel of truth allows us to confess, turn from, or call out hypocrisy, because it is Jesus' track record and not ours that makes us acceptable before God. How should we respond to hypocrisy in the church? Here's how. We should walk in step with the gospel of truth and the truth of the gospel, because it allows us to confess and turn from and call out hypocrisy, because it's Jesus' track record and not ours that makes us acceptable before God. It's Jesus' track record and not ours that makes us acceptable before God. And here's what I love about this whole thing. In a really lovely and fun way, the church is the only place in the whole world that should knowingly welcome hypocrites. Yo, happy Sunday. Welcome to Hypocrites Anonymous. Right? That's the move. It should be a place. Hypocrites Anonymous, we should freely confess together every week that we need help. Will there be times that we fumble? Absolutely, but not Jesus. Will there be times where we slide down into inconsistency? Yeah, but not Christ. Will there be times when we say one thing and do another? Yeah, but not Jesus. It is only his mercy and grace that forgives us and frees us and can actually change us. And by trusting his work on the cross for us, we can actually be transformed to walk the line more faithfully and more humbly hold others to do the same. Again, walking in step with the truth of the gospel allows us to confess and turn from and even call out hypocrisy, because it's Jesus' track record and not ours that makes us acceptable before God. And here's how I know we're on to something with our answer to our question, because that's basically where Paul goes next. I don't want to steal thunder from future sermons, but if you just scroll down in Galatians chapter 2, guess what Paul just says in a few verses? He says this: I am crucified with Christ. The hypocrite me was nailed to the cross with Jesus. Now it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me and who lives through me. The life I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. This is the great remedy for all of our sin, all of our idolatry, all of our hypocrisy, all of our inconsistency, to look at Christ on the cross, giving himself up in sacrificial love for those who don't deserve it, pouring out grace upon grace upon grace for all those who would confess their need and admit their need. And it is here and here alone that we find our salvation and our standard, the gospel line that we're called to walk. Only at the cross.